y si la innovación social es la solución a grandes problemas de la administración pública. Para ello trajimos a Giulio Quagliotto. Él es asesor de innovación para la oficina del primer ministro de los Emiratos Árabes Unidos y ex jefe de la Unidad de Innovación Estratégica del Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo PNUD, donde trabajó también con gobiernos de todo el planeta tratando de resolver grandes retos sobre la intersección entre la innovación social y la tecnología y, por supuesto, el desarrollo internacional. Es investigador del MIT con un enfoque en la innovación basada en los usuarios y miembro del Instituto UCL para la Innovación y el Propósito Público. Ha trabajado en entidades como Climate KIC, también en WWF, Nesta y el Banco Mundial, entre otros. Y fue director de Jakarta Lab del UN Global Pulse, una iniciativa de innovación emblemática del secretario general de las Naciones Unidas sobre Big Data para políticas públicas. Bienvenido, Giulio, fuerte aplauso, lo recibe nuestro público. ¿Qué tal? Por acá. Micrófono, ¿dónde está? Por acá. Ya se lo pasa. Gracias. ¿Qué tal? Claro, arroba.
Okay.
José.
Thank you, and it's a real great honor and pleasure to be here today. Santiago, this morning, started us by asking, what if a government was collaborative? And what I want to pose to you is that actually there is an awful lot of interesting source of innovation for government, but it is often left invisible. Let's see. Oop. Yep. Oh. So, one of the frustrations of working in government, I don't know if it's your same experience, is we often have a one-size-fits-all for many types of problems. Think about budget. Whether you have a project with a small budget or a real big budget, often it's the same process that you need to follow. In fact, sometimes it's almost easier to get approval for a bigger budget than for a small one. Procurement. Sometimes you have to go the same process for procuring something small or for something really big. And maybe innovation and problem solving has the same problem. So let me tell you what I mean. I don't know if it is like you for the same thing with you, but when we are in government, we are often trained to become perfect at problem definition. We go through processes like this, right? Tools like this that says you need to define the problem really, really well, otherwise you're not able to solve it. And this is taken from our colleagues at ENAP, right? So a core competency of a public sector official is good problem definition. Now, this is really the approach that oftentimes is promoted to define the problem very well and then get to the solution. Now, what is the problem with problem definition? Now, first, if you're working with a real complex problem, and in public sector, most of the problems are really complex, almost by definition, you cannot define them very well. Or you need to break them down into smaller problems, but then you lose all the complexity of this problem. The second thing is we talked a lot today about, unfortunately, the tendency of defining problems sitting in a room very, very far away from where the citizens are. And the further you are away from the problem, the more your problem definition is likely to be not very accurate. And the third thing is, if you define the problem really, really, really well, you tend to enforce the feeling that you also know the solution, the expert bias, right? Think about procurement, right? The reason why you had launched a guide today is precisely to say you cannot define the problem and define the solution when you don't even know what the solution could be. That's a different approach to thinking about how you get to a solution, right? So the result of this is that if these are all the solutions that you can possibly explore, in the public sector, often we only explore a very small subset of the solution, and often the most obvious one. So let me give you an example of what I mean. In the UK, unfortunately, there is a problem where lots of young male teenagers in particular commit suicide. So if you put into a room a bunch of experts that say, what do we do about solving young men committing suicide? Most likely, the solution that they tend to think about is counseling, more services, right? Try to detect early sign of things, build mobile apps that, Google, try to find early signs that people are thinking about suicide, right? Enter in this discussion Robert. Robert is a barber. One of his best friends unfortunately committed suicide. All of a sudden, this triggers a thinking in Robert and says, why do young men commit suicide? One of the main reasons is that they don't like to go to a psychologist. But where do young men open up? Where do they talk about a problem? Being a barber, he knows very well that this is actually where they open up. So Robert has trained a bunch of barbers to detect early sign of mental distress. Now, what is the problem if you're in government when you see this? First of all, this is not fits neatly into one department. This is not the Ministry of Health. In fact, this is not a solution for you. It's even a problem, right? And don't even know how to interact with barbers. They're not officially sanctioned. What do you do with it, right? So he had to go through a long process to be accredited by the health system, and eventually, now, in a number of countries, this is a law, that you train barbers to detect early sign of mental health. A similar thing in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, the problem also with suicides and mental health. What is the solution that citizens came up with? They have too little doctors to take care of this. Grandmas sitting on a bench for 1 hour in a village, right? So the grandma is put there, listens to people. This has actually reduced the number of cases of mental health quite significantly. Again, this is not the most obvious solution that a government official necessarily thinks about. So, governments have recognized increasingly that there is another way, right? Not a one-size-fits-all. And you've seen fantastic examples today about a different approach, which says, well, actually, we go back from an initial problem formulation, solution, we understand, and we go back into the problem, right? So I couldn't help taking a picture this morning, inspired by the Igbo team, right, and their approach. It's a perfect example of this, right? You iteratively explore more about the problem, you go back into the solution. And there is a number of governments that are adopting this type of approach. In the UAE, where I sit, my center works on a group of 6 governments called Agile Nations that are really recognized that how can you even solve a problem that you want to regulate if you don't even understand what the technology does? How can you possibly do this? And so they create special places like this regulation lab where basically you try to understand what the technology does, what the problem does, then you find the solution and then you reiterate on it and you go back and forth before you can actually regulate, because only then you really understand what the technology is doing. So this is already a major improvement, but I want to challenge you even further. So, who thinks that you can solve a problem without defining it? Oh, very good. At least one person. Thanks, Charlie. Right? You know what this is? Velcro, right? For clothes. Do you know who invented Velcro, of how Velcro was discovered? Well, a Swiss chemist was very frustrated that he had these things to wear in the lab, but he had to use buttons, right? It was very inconvenient. One day, he walks in the woods, and he has these things that stick to his clothes. He's a chemist, and he thinks, oh my God, can I use this thing to actually create something that allows me to close my clothes? Notice that there is not problem definition here. There was not a committee of experts that produced a policy saying this is the problem. The problem and the solution found themselves. The solution found the problem in a particular way. So I would suggest to you that there is another way to think about this, which is there is another venue where solution and problems find each other. Now, if you don't believe me, I work, as I said, I'm a fellow at the MIT. My professor I work with is called Eric von Hippel. He written this paper called Solving Problems Without Defining Them. And he looks at all the evidence of where problems and solutions and needs find each other in a particular moment. Notice that this is not just a pure random thing. The chemists had a very specific set of expertise, which is activated in the particular moment where he actually finds the need. So because I'm a really pesky person, I thought, what does it mean for government? And I actually ran an experiment. So I was working with the Red Cross in Indonesia, and the problem we were trying to solve is flooding. Yes? So we ran in parallel, so they were really keen to do a challenge. Now a challenge is where you define the problem, and then you ask for experts to solve it, right? And say, come in, give me your solution. So I said, okay, let's do it, but let's do another thing in parallel. Let's send ethnographers to the most remote areas of Indonesia to see what are the villages where flooding is not a problem. Let's come back with the solutions from the challenge and the ethnographers. We put them to a blind panel of innovation specialists, and let's see which solutions win. So who do you think won? The engineers in Jakarta working on the challenge, or the villagers across Indonesia? The villagers, hands down. And we find people like this. Made, in his village, there is no flooding. Made is obsessed with insects. He talks like an insect, he speaks like an insect, he dresses like an insect. It's his passion. Made has discovered that this particular fly eats the waste that clogs the waterways in his village and causes the flooding. Not a single engineer in Jakarta, they came up with blockchain, they came up with mobile apps, they came up with pumps, hydraulics. Not a single one of them thought that insects is potentially part of a solution. Now notice another thing. Made has no interest in becoming a unicorn. He doesn't want to become a startup. He solved his own problem. He has a bartering scheme with all the villages to give his bugs to all the other villagers. He doesn't want to make money. So if you're a government and you want to tap into this innovation, giving him money for a startup fund is not the solution. You need to interact with him in a very different way. So this is the opportunity that I think is invisible for government often, right? There is this expertise that is distributed in the population. This is activated in the moment of need. So Made is obsessed with insects and is activated when his village gets the flooding. And because he's got this expertise, he solves a problem. These type of innovators typically solve problems ahead of a private sector or the public sector. They are not interested, as I said, in becoming a unicorn. And they often explore very non-obvious solutions. To find them, the problem for government is that you cannot think like Linnaeus. Government is a taxonomy machine. The barber doesn't fit the health system. Made does not fill your engineering department. And so the beautiful classification of eternal qualities doesn't work for this type of people. You need to think like Darwin. You need to have an obsessive interest in the outliers, the people who do not fit into the middle, but have very neat expertise on the side, and you want to find them. Another thing about this type of innovation, has any of you heard about the concept of exaptation? This comes from evolution and basically says, for example, reptiles originally developed feathers not to fly, but actually to release heat. Right? So these evolved naturally to release heat. Then they found that they have this thing, they start flapping and they start flying. Okay? So something was created for a purpose, heat, and is being reused for flying. Citizens, particularly in moment of crisis, and crises are exaptation machine that triggers this phenomenon that I just showed you. COVID has been a fantastic example of this. Yes? So you've all seen an incredible example here in Colombia. We heard it, right? The classical example is this, right? So this is a scuba diving equipment that was repurposed all of us immediately for respiration, right? All sorts of examples of this thing happening. The OECD has actually done a report looking at all these innovations and said that once again, public sector and international development organization missed the boat. All this incredible level of innovation that was created through exaptation in the moment of crisis was not often tapped into. And again, citizens often got there, citizens in need, got there faster than the official public services or the private sector services. So, if you buy into my theory, back to this, there is another venue that government can use to actually tap into innovation, which is this funny space where solution and problem find themselves. So what can be done to harness this? We talked a lot about new processes and capabilities this day. I'll tell you a little bit about reframing scale, and then we'll talk about one concrete example in health. So new processes, how do you find these people? Until recently, if you worked in the National Innovation Foundation in India, in your contract, you had to walk once every 6 months into the most remote area of India, and you could not allow to ask people what you need. What you had to look for is what have you already solved, right? And then bring this back and say, what do we do about this innovation? When I worked at UNDP, we created a specific position. We created 90 labs, and one of the positions in this lab was called the solution mapper. And the idea was, before we move into the process of problem definition and all of that, which is still needed, can we actually look at where the problem has already been solved? And what can we learn from it? Positive deviance. Does anybody know the story of this? How did Vietnam got out of a malnutrition crisis that it had in the 60s? Well, they tried all the obvious things, and then there were 2 backpackers from Australia that were traveling through Vietnam, and they started asking, why is this village that we found has no malnutrition problem? And they discovered that it was because the way that the mothers were feeding their kids in that particular village. That became national policy, and this is actually how Vietnam got out of that particular crisis. I still have to find a government innovation department or otherwise that has a positive deviant department. If you know of anyone, please let me know. And the good thing is now with the new sources of data, you can actually do this in a new and clever way. So this is a project that GIZ initiated, which is called Data Power Positive Deviance, and is basically looking, in this particular case in Ecuador, which are the farmers that have already solved a particular problem looking at satellite data, right? How can you find them? And then you ask, how can we get more of these people, right? Now, the other thing that you can do these days is you can actually crawl the web for particular patterns. The people who do this type of innovation say, I hacked this, or I improved that. And you can look across the whole web, and you can find them in ways that was not possible to do before. Now, often, I will have seen that I'm insisting on this point that this is not the same as running a challenge. And there's nothing wrong with challenges, don't get me wrong. It's just a very different process. So Lego is one of these companies that has embraced this particular form of innovation. Lego has found out that on average, Lego players invent new products 6 months ahead of their own internal R&D department. And so when you go to the Lego site, you have two very different venues. You have for people who have an idea, and that's a challenge. But then they ask a very different path for people who already solved a particular problem. And that's a very different intake process. And the difference is the people who have an idea might be very far away from the problem. They don't know whether it works or not. It may be a brilliant idea. They just might often don't know. People who already solved the problem are actually have a different type of incentive and a different type of way of doing this. This is an article that compares, once again, this different type of innovation inside Ford, if you are interested. How does this apply to government? The French government has a very interesting program called the State Startup. In its first iteration, what they did is they asked public servants not, do you have an idea how do we solve this? They asked them, have you already solved something? Now this is a very tricky question to ask in government, because often you find people who are very frustrated with an IT system or a procurement system or whatever. They found their way around it, and it's very dangerous to say that you found your way around it, right? It's a very different type of incentive. Anyway, so they created this, and one of the startups that came out of this is this, which we awarded an award recently in Dubai. Now, Matti is an economist that was extremely frustrated with the modeling system that was provided to him by his ministry. He hacked the modeling system and created something much more sophisticated, but until this program was in place, he was not allowed to tell anybody, because in fact he would get into trouble if he did. The incentive here is again very different, right? And so once this was finally acknowledged, they could actually tap into him as an innovator. Now, we find innovators. An interesting question is, how do you scale these type of things? Because these are not necessarily innovators that want to become startups. One way you can think about this is, how do you scale the ability to solve, not the solution? If this innovation ability is distributed across the population, how do you tap into it? So examples, you probably are familiar with this project in Chile. This is after the earthquake. The government usually build houses, right, for people who are affected by the earthquake. And often these houses do not meet the local needs of local people. This is the half-house project, where the government decided to build only half of a house in a modular way, and then told the communities, you build the other half, as a way to tapping into their expertise and the way to customize this to their needs. I assume many of you know the Semáforo de la Pobreza project in Paraguay, and there what they did is they basically reverse engineering poverty surveys. Household surveys are typically very extractive. If you are a poor person, there is no value in you providing the data to the government. You don't know what happens with it. You are asked lots of questions, takes lots of your time, doesn't really help you. They basically reverse engineered this and said, what if actually household surveys were useful to poor people? And so what they do through this mechanism is they allow people to create their own plan to get out of poverty. And through this, tapping into the expertise, again, very close to the problem of people to create actually their own solutions. And now I'm going to embarrass Diana. So another project we showcased in Dubai is, of course, the Manzana del Cuidado. And even if it was not necessarily designed this way, you can imagine it as one of these platforms where you scale the ability to solve rather than the solution. You are enabled by providing time to actually create and allow people to find their own solutions, often very innovative. Once again, a word of caution, not everybody wants to be a funder. The Chinese government has found this the hard way. They had for a long time called the mass innovation policy, which was basically they created thousands of maker spaces across the country. And the assumption was that people in the maker spaces all wanted to become entrepreneurs. Many of these type of innovators just want to solve their own problem, and they're quite happy giving it away for free. So if you don't have a different path for diffusion, you're not going able to tap into it. So I'm closing by giving you an example, fictitious. Oftentimes when I talk about this type of innovation, people say, well, but this is very small scale. It doesn't really affect big systems. So let's walk through an example of how this type of innovation could be tapped for collaborative government to tackle a big problem. Now, I'm going to pick on the health system, but before I go there, I want to make a general point. One of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this type of innovation is that innovation that it already exists in the population. It's something that doesn't need to be created. It's something that it's not the best practice from abroad that needs to be imported. So this book is a fantastic story of how China moved out of poverty, right? An awful lot of people in an incredible amount of time escaped out of poverty. And the theory that Yuan Yang poses is that the reason why they were able to get out of poverty is because they did exactly the opposite of what the World Bank, the UN, and all the other organizations were telling them to do, which was you need to get perfect institutions, super transparent, accountable, wonderful governance, only then you can develop. China took exactly the opposite path and say, considering where we are, we'd work with what we have and we start from there. And so, in development, there is this famous sentence, say, don't go to Denmark, no offense to Christian Basin, right? Which basically says you don't take a best practice from Denmark and plant it into Colombia and think that it's going to work. It's a much likely strategy to succeed to work with what you have and take it from there. And tapping into this type of innovation is one way of doing that. So I am so encouraged by looking at the ecosystem that you have here, because I think this is a perfect example of what this can be done. So let's talk about a really tough problem, health system. In most countries, very difficult to sustain financially, often very in the hands of very important power relations, and certainly when it comes to R&D, in the head of big pharma companies, right? So what can be done by tapping in this type of innovation that I talked about to change the health system? Patient innovation is a platform that looks at all the patients that solve their own disease. Why? Because you have a very niche disease, no company is interested in solving your disease, and the public sector often doesn't have resources. This is Luis. Luis is a DJ. He also has a very particular problem to his lungs, which means he needs to go to the hospital to get a very particular type of treatment. One day he goes to the opera. He realizes that the vibration he gets from the music is actually the same that is used by the machine he gets at the hospital. He's a DJ, he hacks one of his DJ machines, brings it at home, and creates his own way to cure himself without having to go to the hospital. Luis doesn't want to become a startup. Luis is super happy to give his innovation for free, but he has no way to do it, except to put it on the web. So patient innovation is a platform that tap into all this type of innovation developed by patients that actually could provide a very different type of solutions. And again, as you can see, non-obvious solutions, right? DJ solutions. Nurses. Nurses innovate all the time because the products that they get from the market are designed for the average patient. And so when you actually, I have a friend who did a study on the journals of nurses. Now, the Journal of Nurses in the US for 20 years was called the Journal of Improvisation. Imagine this. Official Journal of Nurses called the Journal of Improvisation, and they were capturing all the nurses, all the innovation they did to the standard products. If you're a nurse, you have zero incentive to diffuse this innovation because you might get into trouble. How do you actually design mechanism to tap into this? Doctors discover new uses of medicine extremely frequently. There is even a term for this, which is called off-label. So they treat people, and sometimes they discover that one medicine that was created for one purpose actually can solve a completely different disease. Again, zero incentive for the doctors to diffuse this type of innovation. So the really interesting question when you talk about this type of innovation and what government can do to change, for example, the health system, is how do you design commons? Places where people can diffuse this innovation, which are not based on the assumption that they want to become an enterprise. And I think, to me, this is an interesting new skills when we talk about public goods and digital public goods that new governments are going to develop more and more. This is just an example of this. It's called the open infrastructure, and it's basically a way to democratize all the infrastructure that is needed to diffuse research also in medicine. If you take my example that problems and solutions find themselves in very creative ways, you will see that there are organizations that are taking a very different approach to funding research. This is the Volkswagen Foundation, that very proudly says we give away money through a lottery. So long as you give us proposals of a certain quality, we'll fund it completely randomly. Why? Because this is proven to be an actual better way to get innovations than having a panel of experts to review this. Because the experts bring their own bias to the judgment process. Distributing money at random, actually, so long as certain criteria are met, it actually gives you better results. So you will say, well, no public service institution will ever do that, right? This is public money. This is the actual health department in New Zealand very proudly announcing that we're giving money away randomly, so long as they meet a particular type of criteria. So all of these, right? So I'll conclude on this, right? And just saying, if you follow this, you will see that the approaches that you all might want to take to change the health system could be actually quite different in terms of identify the patients that innovate, doctors that innovate, the nurses that innovate, create diffusion mechanism for this, creating new interfaces, new way of funding mechanisms, and new ways of thinking R&D. So we can indeed have more options that maybe we thought about in terms of actually funding and diffusing innovation. Where I work, the government has created something called the Ministry of Possibilities, which is a way to actually encourage people in the public sector to think really radically different about different systems. And so I think that by working together, we can create many different types of new possibilities and tap into this invisible innovation. Thank you.
Viene. Ok, no bien. Perfecto, pues en este momento gracias, muchísimas gracias, por supuesto, Julio. Usted es un gurú top. Venga conmigo, venga conmigo. Con ustedes, invito a nuestro escenario a Diana Rodríguez. Ella es secretaria distrital de la mujer y está aquí porque una de las más importantes innovaciones, no solamente de Bogotá, no solamente de Colombia, sino del mundo, son las manzanas del cuidado. La escuchamos. Bienvenido, fuerte aplauso, por favor.
Hola, muy buenas tardes. Realmente el placer es para mí estar en este escenario con Julio y entonces yo voy a tratar que mis preguntas estén a la altura y hackearle un poquito esa inteligencia y provocarlo a ver qué podemos sacar de acá. No puedo dejar de resistir empezar preguntando por las manzanas del cuidado, porque ver las manzanas del cuidado acá, ver las manzanas del cuidado mencionadas, ¿no?, en los Emiratos, pues provoca dos cosas. Uno, por supuesto, emoción. Dos, que innovar vale la pena, pero también le apunta a esto que decía Julio, de que todo el tiempo buscamos para afuera. No, que acá no vamos a poder, que tenemos que buscar afuera, que las soluciones están afuera. Entonces quiero empezar preguntándote, Julio, ¿tú por qué crees que las manzanas del cuidado son una plataforma para innovación social o consisten en innovación, cuando la innovación todo el día la pensamos más techy, más orientada a otro tipo de tecnología que no es social?
Well, there are so many aspects of a project that are interesting, but for the purpose of what we just discussed, what that provides you in an extreme level of proximity to the problems, and presumably the people who also solve some of these problems in very creative ways. So on one hand, you can think about this as an infrastructure, where you can do what we just talked about, right? Being close to the citizens. I'm sure you met incredible women and otherwise caregivers who have figured out incredible ways to work around the limitations of what they have. And so you have all of a sudden view on this incredible level of distributed innovation in the city. One. The second part of this is that the idea of creating time for people who didn't have time before, you can create the conditions then to say, okay, you have this incredible creativity, now you have also time to do more with it. Can you think about new mechanisms to diffuse what you've done? Again, I imagine many of these people have solved their own problem, but they don't want to become a startup, right? So can you actually create, by giving them time, ways to share more about what they've done with others? Because probably they don't mind sharing, right? And they have a very different incentive to do it. So you have created the social infrastructure to be able to do some of the things that can allow others to get inspired, diffuse the innovation, find the innovators. And I think that's a very interesting angle to look at what you're doing, even if they were not designed necessarily with this framing, right? They were designed with another thing, but if you look at it from an innovation perspective, I think that's a super interesting example, and I'm not surprised that people all over the world want to come and learn from you, right?
Pues acabo de caer en cuenta que cuando estamos Julio y yo hablando de las manzanas y se vean ahí, no sé qué tanta gente acá conoce las manzanas del cuidado, que son la principal apuesta a innovación social de la alcaldesa Claudia López. Y las manzanas del cuidado, Julio lo decía, es una solución básica, pero que resuelve y que le apunta a realmente darle tiempo, ¿no? Hablamos todo el tiempo que el recurso más escaso es el tiempo. Pero, ¿cómo? Y decimos, pero eso no se puede crear. No, sí se puede crear. Y las manzanas del cuidado lo que hacen es eso. Le brindan servicios a quienes nos han cuidado toda la vida. A la mamá, a la abuela, a la tía, que todo el tiempo se la pasan cuidando. Cuidando al niño, a la persona mayor, cocinando, planchando. Es decir, haciendo esos trabajos de cuidado que sostienen a la sociedad y que por eso han puesto sus vidas en pausa. Y en las manzanas del cuidado les damos tiempo para que dejen de poner sus vidas en pausa, para que puedan ir a terminar el bachillerato, no importa si tienen 40, 50 o 60 años, para que puedan aprender a usar un celular, para que puedan aprender a montar en bicicleta. Es decir, todo lo que han puesto de lado por esa sobrecarga de cuidado, por no tener tiempo. ¿Y cómo les damos el tiempo? Les damos el tiempo resolviendo una cosa que las mujeres efectivamente entendimos hace muchos años, y es que otros nos ayuden a cuidar un rato. Cuando uno le pide a su mamá, cuídame a mi hijo un segundo, es porque lo que quieres es tiempo. Pues eso hacemos en las manzanas. En las manzanas cuidamos a quienes ellas cuidan, a sus nietos, a sus hijos, a las personas mayores, a las personas con discapacidad ahí, y con eso les hemos liberado tiempo y carga de culpa para que ellas puedan continuar sus proyectos de vida, estudiar, terminar el bachillerato, aprender tecnología, dejar la ropa lavando, no tener lo que hacer. Entonces, a eso se refiere. Una cosa que...
Can I say one more thing?
Pero, please, it's you who
So
should be talking.
there is many of you might have seen this study which is called The Lost Einsteins and Marie Curie. It basically says what are all the innovators that are lost because they don't have the opportunity to do this. So, right? It's a big study that was done in the US originally and then has been replicated in many other countries. So one of the other ways to think about what you just said is, and obviously one of the things that the lost Einsteins and Marie Curies miss is time, as well, of course, as education opportunities, etc., right? In some ways, you can also think about it as a way of what you're creating a space is maybe recuperate some of these lost Marie Curie and Einsteins that you have here, right?
Sí, y sin duda hemos tenido algunas mujeres, no lo habíamos pensado así, para nada, pero sí tenemos muchas mujeres que cuando les hemos dado el tiempo, les cuidamos a sus hijos, les permitimos lavar la ropa en una lavandería pública. ¿Cuál es la peor pérdida de tiempo? Mujeres lavando horas y horas a mano. Pero cuando les liberamos el tiempo, pudieron crear sus propios negocios. Ayer conocí a una mujer, Nancy, que está en Puente Aranda, que montó un negocio de cupcakes y pescadería, siempre mezclado además, que nunca lo había visto, y que dijo, voy a ser la mejor de esta localidad, siempre lo soñé, pero no había tenido el tiempo de hacerlo. Y así como ella, hay muchas que me muestran, mire, hice esta blusa, esta chaqueta, mire lo que puse a hacer, o ya nos inventamos otra forma de crear negocios entre nosotras mismas, porque ahora tenemos tiempo y quién cuida a nuestros hijos. A mí me encantó el caso del DJ, de Luis, ¿sí? Luis. Y creo que como Luis, hay millones de personas por fuera del gobierno, pero también en los gobiernos, que no quieren volverse el próximo unicornio, pero quieren aportar. Pero por alguna razón los gobiernos no tenemos cómo acceder, o no sabemos, o volvemos a empezar. ¿Por qué? ¿Qué nos pasa a los gobiernos? ¿Cuáles son esos obstáculos que tenemos que sobrepasar para poder aprovechar a los Luises que están en el gobierno o a los Luises que están afuera del gobierno?
Well, that's a complicated question, but one of the things goes back to this taxonomy issue. You're often, let's say you're an environmental specialist, you get into the environment of department, but you happen also to be a DJ. Government couldn't care less that you're a DJ, right? You are hired to be an environmentalist, and if you have found a solution that taps into the other side of your life, frankly, we are not interested, right? So there's a little bit of that. There's actually a very interesting experiment in the Canadian government has created a mechanism exactly for this. It basically says, do you have a very different type of expertise that is completely dead in your current department? We they called it the cloud, talent cloud, and they said, apply to this so you finally can use this thing that you actually really have great expertise on and bring it back to government. The second thing goes to this issue about often this thing, these bureaucracy hackers, you found a way around it, you really are in trouble the moment you actually say it. The example that I showed you very quickly from Ford, what they did is they went to all the, imagine Ford as a car company, right? So we have hundreds, if not thousands of engineers, and these guys are extremely frustrated with their IT system. They have all rules, firewalls, whatever, but don't allow them to do all the geeky stuff that an engineer wants to do. So they create thousands of hacks to the official system. Once you find them and you liberate them, that thousands of hacks become the new IT system of Ford that actually empowers people to do things, right? This is what they did through this particular process. So what do you do to actually get people who are very shy and say, oh, no, don't tell anybody because I get fired? How do you create, again, a different type of mechanism to share this type of innovations is one thing. The final thing I'll say is, you probably know there is a famous program called the Adobe Kickbox. So if you used to work at Adobe, at any point in time, you could be called in a training and you would be given a toolkit saying how to innovate and a $1,000 prepaid credit card and say, go and innovate. And the assumption was that people would spend all of this on beer, right? But they said, okay, you innovate. If you innovate and you bring back an interesting prototype, we give you a blue box, but we don't tell you what's inside the blue box. With this mechanism, Adobe has reduced its cost of R&D dramatically. So I talked to the person who created this program, and I said, why did you do it? And he said, I was so frustrated that people came to us with ideas for new products without having a single conversation with our customers. At least they can use the $1,000 to have a beer with a customer and say, would you use this, right? What they did is they distributed the R&D function from a few engineers centrally to all the people who take part of this program. Creating many new products, and what do they do with it? And they reduce the costs. Can government do the same? And tap in all this distributed expertise across the government sector. We did that in the UAE, right? So we could do the same type of thing in different and other places.
Pero además creo que esa es una apuesta también. A veces hay una mirada injusta sobre el funcionario público, sobre el burócrata. Como no, está ahí y va de 9 a 5. Y no le interesa. Primero, si algo tengo absoluta admiración es por los funcionarios públicos que hacen y resuelven problemas todos los días ahí, sin los titulares y sin aparecer con aplausos en todas partes, sino más con investigaciones que con aplausos. Entonces, lo primero es eso. Pero lo segundo es que tal vez los estamos dejando es dormirse en el escritorio, ¿no? y cansarse en lugar de permitirles volver a innovar. Así que yo misma me llevo eso como, voy a ir como a activar a mis equipos a ver qué me estoy perdiendo. Voy a terminar con una pregunta, y es la pregunta de la sostenibilidad y del largo plazo. Tal vez desde el sector público, desde los gobiernos hay un susto de, bueno, si pongo esta gran idea a andar, pero este gobierno dura 4 años, ¿cómo hago? ¿Vale la pena? Y entonces rápidamente se matan ideas porque ¿quién lo va a hacer sostenible? Sobre todo, digamos, en gobiernos democráticos donde por lo menos hay alguna alternancia, no sé, estarán 2 periodos, pero no 8. Entonces está la pregunta de ¿cómo hacer para mantener estas innovaciones y sobre todo para apagarle el miedo a innovar por no poder garantizar desde el inicio el largo plazo?
Yeah, so that's one of this morning, for those of you who were in the presentation from Christian, he talked about the challenge of creating long-term thinking to government that is designed to be often short-term thinking, right? Political cycle. So just one example that I always like to quote. So I talked to a team in the Ministry of Education in Indonesia. And I talked to them because they are the only innovation team I ever met that has as a motto to make innovation irreversible. And I said, what do you mean by irreversible? I said, look, we are very successful, and we know that what this means is that because we are very successful, the moment there is a new minister, even if it's from the same party, they will want to kill us because we were associated with the previous ministers, right? This is life in government, right? So they started thinking, how do you actually make the things that we do now, by design, irreversible? How do we at least maximize the chances that we will survive another administration, another change of thing, etc.? And I think it's a very, very interesting, sets lots of interesting questions, right? Hey, do you want to make innovation irreversible? That's a big political question. 2, if you do, what are the processes to do it? And so I think it's really interesting to look at examples, and you have quite a lot here in Latin America we were just discussing over lunch, right? Whether it's this Genova that we talked this morning, Laboratorio de Gobierno in Chile, or other places that survived. Different governments, different cycles, with some kind of longer-term thinking. How do we do this? How do we make innovation irreversible if we want to do it? I think it's a really interesting open question, and I think it's interesting to put this question back to us. Can we make some of these things irreversible?
Julio, muchas gracias. Me habían hecho señas de que el tiempo ya se había acabado. Sí, veo que perfecto, ya. Pero creo que es un perfecto forma de empezar, de terminar, diciendo que pensemos además hacer la innovación irreversible, no al final, no como el último, ¿no? Salir del esquema de pensar que eso solo cuando funcionó, entonces ahí lo queremos hacer irreversible, sino pensarlo desde el principio, incluso desde la mitad, y no temer a pensar en esas formas de garantizar que esta innovación y esta capacidad y estas nuevas formas de pensar puedan durar, y que tal vez si lo vemos así, pues pueda ser además más atractivo para las siguientes administraciones y un estímulo para esos burócratas, hackers, innovadores, tanto por dentro y por fuera. Muchas gracias a Festivo, muchas gracias, y por supuesto un aplauso para Julio.
Bogotá tiene mucho que contar.